Good morning, YouTube. Day 2 of the US Open, round 2, different oil pattern, 47 feet, and what will I expect? Well, I think the scoring pace is going to go from high to low. Typically, when they run these types of patterns, 47 feet, you have to play them further inside. And so it usually feels pretty nice in the first few games, but because we've all started relatively far left, the lanes just get really messy. And so you're going to see across the whole house a lot of lofting, a lot of speed, and it's going to be an absolute grind later in the day. So I do have a couple of ideas on how to combat that. Yeah, I can definitely try the loft, definitely try the speed, see how that looks and shapes. Maybe catch a couple of good pairs. But usually the left side of the lane is pretty unaffected by as much transition. So if the lanes start off playing a little softer, it may come into play throwing the backup ball. Even if it's just to see some type of consistency with ball motion. So that's in the back of my head too. But we'll find out what I actually do when I'm out on the lanes. But I'm excited. I feel really good. Had a really good sleep. Yeah, let me lace them up. Let me get out there. I'm ready. Well, not quite yet. When I get there, I will be ready. Okay, not a horrible start. I thought, considering the feel that I had halfway through that game, I thought it could have been a little bigger than that, but that 10th frame just wasn't a great shot. And then, I don't know what frame it was, maybe 6 or 7, where I just for the kids, they'll like that one, back up. Yeah, just got away from me and didn't execute and got punished. So yeah, I guess if you had told me at the start, you'll start with 220, would you take it? I probably would have said, yeah, sure. So stay positive, stay confident, stay relaxed, see what happens. Okay, 279. If you ever hear me complain about carry, remind me of that last game. Okay? I got a little lucky, but we took it, we ran, had a couple of good shots down the stretch for 270, and now we've jumped to the other end of the building. So as we always do, just made a big move further left, because this end of the house plays with a lot more friction in the middle. Same ball, kind of doing the same thing, just moved a little further left. All right, we're off to a good start. 6.9 on the hardest pair in the house, statistically speaking. Yeah, that pair is it's really unforgiving. You hit it a little too much, you give it just a pinch more room, and it doesn't look so good. So I really thought I was going to make that 3, 6, 9, 10 too. It was a really good spare attempt. I thought I made it, but clearly physics says no. So now we've moved to the next pair. Definitely a little more float to the front, but still not quite as forgiving as some of the other pairs down the other end. So we've got to make some good shots. I'm still in the same ball, still doing the same thing. Alright, wish me luck. We've got a couple of off hits, a couple of good shots. 250. Alright, things are rolling. Things are rolling, but I mean, we're only halfway through the block and the whole field is already very, very far left. So it's going to get pretty messy. So kind of now is that time to start thinking, okay, well, how are you going to combat that? The big problem is I'm watching some of the lefties bowl and it doesn't look so good on their side either. So the idea of the backup shot is scaring me a little bit. So we'll keep an eye on them. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing until this stops working. We're doing all right. We're doing all right. Disappointing. Woodland typically has some pretty sticky approaches and just a couple of shots. Yeah, the footing just didn't feel great. Then we made a ball change, thought, oh, we can still get that 210 game or 200 game, and then yeah, just a couple of very stubborn pins got in the way. But yeah, missed a couple of spares in the last couple of games. It's just frustrating. So you try to get it out of your mind, but yeah, it eats at you. Just like a little worm, kind of going through your head, eating little bits of you all day. So, gotta let it go. Gotta regroup. Gotta throw some good shots now. back. It's not a good shot. Just too in my head, worried about what the lane was going to do. Listen there, don't worry about the lane, just execute a good shot. That's a little disappointing to end on that note. It's a very, very, very horrible pair. Worst time to catch it. Last game. It's just there's no oil on the lane, and yeah, sucks. You know, you fight so hard, and then you just feel like catch the pair left of you or catch the pair right of you at the end, and it's probably a little different finish. But yeah, I'll gradually feel better about today. But having just finished with 150, yeah, lunch is going to taste a little sour. But anyway, got ourselves higher up the ladder, and that's all that I was trying to do. If I can do that every single vlog, we'll make the TV show. So, big day tomorrow, 35-foot flat. Plastic will be going down for sure. Oh, let me do this game again. Might be worse if I did it again.
G'day, thanks for watching. If you loved this one, check out the rest of the videos from this playlist or any other playlist. Make sure that you like the video and please subscribe if you would love to be the first to catch any of the latest of the behind the scenes and a whole lot of other cool stuff.